Imagine a town where mornings begin with the sound of roosters crowing behind wooden fences, where neighbors greet one another by name at the corner gas station, where the rhythm of life is slow, predictable, safe. Pontotoc County, Mississippi, a place where the weight of history presses down gently, where the soil is red with clay, and where everyone seems to know everyone else's story. But on one August morning in 2024, that illusion cracked. And when it cracked, it did not merely fracture. It split wide open, revealing something dark, something unspeakable, something that could not be explained away as an accident of circumstance. The name whispered first in hushed tones, Filiberto Gonzalez Tovar. To some in town, he was just another man who had found work in the fields, in construction, in the invisible jobs that prop up rural America. To others, he was a stranger, a face they barely registered at all. But by the time his name appeared in local newspapers, it was no longer attached to anonymity. It was shackled to accusation. A previously deported illegal immigrant from Mexico allegedly raped a 10-year-old boy in Mississippi. 2 counts of rape of a child. The headline itself carried a weight that changed the way people walked into grocery stores, the way mothers looked at their children on school buses, the way fathers locked doors at night. Fear had entered the bloodstream of Pontotoc County, and it came not just from the act itself, but from the revelation of what it suggested, that danger could live here among them, unannounced, unseen. For investigators, the moment of arrest was not just the culmination of evidence, but the beginning of questions that cut deeper than handcuffs. They asked themselves, who was this man? How had he come here? What histories followed him like shadows? And for the people of Pontotoc, the rupture was more intimate. How could this have happened here? In towns like this, evil is always imagined as something external, an intruder breaking through the window, a story told on the evening news about another state, another city. But when the evil carries a local address, when it is arrested on soil you drive across daily, the psychological wound runs differently. It is no longer out there. It is here. At first, the case appeared straightforward. A man accused, a community shaken, law enforcement moving swiftly. But as with every true crime story, the first chapter is never the whole book. For beneath the surface, there was another layer, one that made this case not only about a single act of violence, but about the fragility of the systems meant to prevent it. Federal databases began to stir with recognition. The name Gonzalez Tovar did not belong to a blank slate. He was not a man without history. There was a file, a record, a trace that stretched back to 2017, a year when the United States government had already ordered him removed, deported, sent away. If he was already removed once, then how is he standing in Mississippi in 2024? That question, hanging heavy in the silence of living rooms and kitchen tables across America, became the heartbeat of this story. To grasp the weight of this crime, you must imagine the ordinariness it shattered. The child victim, unnamed here, unexploited, protected, represents not only innocence but trust. Trust in the routine safety of daily life. Trust in the unspoken promise that childhood is a shield. And when that trust is broken, it is not just the child who suffers. It is the entire community. Parents recalculate their assumptions about safety. Teachers look differently at the faces of children in classrooms. Even those untouched by proximity to the crime carry a psychic wound. The knowledge that safety is never absolute. In those first days, law enforcement moved in widening circles. They documented, they collected, they secured evidence. The chain of custody became their fragile lifeline to justice. Every photograph taken, every piece of physical evidence bagged, every statement recorded, each detail represented the difference between a conviction and a collapse. But even in those early hours, investigators felt the pull of something larger than themselves. There was a ghost in the room. The possibility that this case was not merely about a man and a child, but about a system that had failed long before the crime was committed. Communities process horror differently. In Pontotoc, whispers carried faster than official statements. In gas stations, churches, and barbershops, the story mutated. Some focused on a crime. Others latched onto the immigration status. Some whispered fearfully about children, others angrily about borders. And in that mix, something dangerous grew. The temptation to simplify a complex reality into an easy scapegoat. But the truth, as investigators would later reveal, was neither simple nor comfortable. A truth that will demand we confront not only the man accused, but the systems that carried him here. A truth that forces us to ask, what is safety worth when its promise is already broken? In every crime, there's a surface. The surface tells us what happened. A man arrested, a charge filed, a headline written. But surfaces deceive. They calm us with the illusion of closure, as if naming the act is the same as understanding it. The hidden history of Filiberto González Tovar reveals otherwise. For while Pontotoc County was just beginning to reckon with the enormity of the charges in 2024, somewhere deep in federal archives, his name was already written. The file was not fresh. It was dated. Back in 2017, an immigration judge had already signed a removal order. Deportation. Think of what that means. Somewhere in a courtroom, 7 years earlier, the United States government determined that González Tovar had no legal right to remain. He was escorted out, placed beyond the border. Case closed. At least it should have been. But now, in 2024, law enforcement in Mississippi found themselves staring at the same name. And with it, a single question that echoed like a drumbeat. How is he here again? For investigators, this discovery was more than an administrative detail. It was a fracture in the narrative. They were no longer investigating just a crime. They were investigating a failure. The psychology of that moment cannot be overstated. Detectives, trained to follow evidence in linear paths, suddenly faced a story that doubled back on itself. They had to hold two truths at once. A violent crime had allegedly been committed in their county. The accused should never have been in their county to begin with. When whispers of the deportation history leaked into the community, the reaction was immediate. For some, it hardened anger. For others, it blurred the lines between crime and immigration. But in both cases, it deepened the wound. The psychology of a small town thrives on predictability. It's the comfort of knowing who your neighbors are, the safety of believing you can account for the lives around you. But when a hidden history emerges, when someone you thought was simply present carries a past you never imagined, trust dissolves. Investigators began reaching outward. They contacted federal partners, pulled DHS records, cross-checked identifiers. Each new piece of data widened the circle. Fingerprints confirmed identity. Removal orders matched. The timeline reconstructed itself. 2017 removal, an undocumented return, silent years in between, until 2024. The case was no longer confined to Pontotoc. It was stretching across jurisdictions, across years, across systems. And then came the first revelation that shifted perception. In May 2025, months after his arrest on state charges, a federal grand jury indicted González Tovar for illegal reentry. Court documents spelled it out plainly. He had re-entered the United States after prior removal, without permission, without legal status. The indictment was short, clinical, stripped of emotion. But to those following the case, its implications thundered. What else lies buried in the spaces between state and federal systems? If one man could move silently across those lines, how many others have done the same? In the background of every revelation was the unspoken truth. While systems shuffled papers, a child's life had been shattered. This is the cruel psychology of such cases. The violence is immediate, intimate, irreversible. The systems are slow, procedural, indifferent. Viewers are forced into a double vision, seeing both the intimate wound of a victim and the bureaucratic slowness of institutions. That contrast itself becomes part of the horror. By now, the community's fear had transformed into suspicion, not just of González Tovar, but of institutions. If the government had known about him in 2017, if records existed, if his deportation was a matter of fact, then why did he stand in Mississippi in 2024? The question burrowed deeper. Are we protected, or are we simply waiting for failures to reveal themselves? So, the hidden history surfaced. A removal order, a silent reentry, a federal indictment that reframed everything. And with it, the first cracks in perception spread wider. This case was not just about an act of violence. It was about borders porous not only on maps, but in minds. About systems that promise protection, but often deliver delay. And asking, inevitably, what happens when two worlds collide? The intimate violence of a crime and the cold machinery of federal law. Every crime is an intersection, a place where two paths meet. But in Pontotoc County, Mississippi, 2024, the paths were not simply local. One led inward to the broken body and spirit of a child. The other led outward into the vast machinery of federal immigration enforcement. And when those two paths collided, the case transformed. No longer just about an individual, no longer just about a town. It became a mirror reflecting the fractures of an entire nation. First, the state charges. Pontotoc County prosecutors filed counts of statutory rape, crimes as grave as they come. But courtrooms move slowly, and silence hangs heavy in the gaps. Witness interviews, pretrial motions, hearings delayed. Through 2024, the docket filled with paper, but not with resolution. For the victim and their family, time itself became a second wound. Every day suspended in uncertainty. Then clarity of a different kind, the federal indictment. Illegal reentry after removal. A charge that carries up to 20 years in prison when tied to serious criminal conduct. Federal prosecutors are efficient. They do not linger. Hearings were set, motions filed, plea negotiations discussed. The contrast was sharp. While the state case staggered forward, the federal case moved with chilling precision. Imagine the psychology of Pontotoc's investigators. They had worked tirelessly to gather evidence, to build a state case around a child victim. Now they watched as federal prosecutors shifted the focus from a child's trauma to the abstract language of border enforcement. Both were true. Both were real. But the focus of justice seemed to tilt away from the intimate wound and toward the structural breach. For many, it felt like the victim's story risked being swallowed whole by the machinery of law. Investigators now faced a double burden, feeding evidence into the state system while tracking proceedings in the federal system. The timelines did not align. Court dates overlapped. Priorities clashed. Some feared the federal sentence, could eclipse the state's ability to prosecute. If Gonzalez Tovar were locked in federal prison, would the state ever see its day in court? And here lies the cruelest part of the collision. The victim's voice, already fragile, risked displacement. The federal case did not need their testimony, did not need to relive their trauma. It was built on documents, fingerprints, orders, and dates. For the victim, the paradox was unbearable. On one hand, relief, no need to stand in open court, no need to face the accused. On the other, erasure, the deepest wound of their life reduced to a side note in a federal filing. For the community, the collision revealed a larger fracture. What does justice mean when two systems clash? Is it measured in years served? In acknowledgement of harm? In public accountability? Mississippi residents began asking, will the child's pain be recognized in open court, or will it vanish into the abstraction of immigration law? This is the moment where the story itself shifts. What began as a crime investigation in a small county now becomes a referendum on the very meaning of justice. The question is no longer who did it. The suspect stands indicted. The question is which system holds the right to speak for the victim. Is justice about punishment, or is it about recognition? If a perpetrator serves time, but the victim's voice is never heard, has justice truly been served? Picture the family of the victim. Each court date circled on calendars. Each headline read in quiet dread. State hearings postponed. Federal proceedings marching forward. In the silence between, a family waits. And waiting is its own kind of violence. When two worlds collide, the impact is not just legal. It is psychological. It fractures faith in systems, it unsettles communities, and it leaves victims suspended in a liminal space, caught between silence and abstraction. Justice demands more than suspicion. It demands proof. But proof is fragile. It lives on swabs and fibers, on memory and testimony. And in Pontotoc County, the machinery of evidence began to turn, slow, grinding, relentless. Detectives moved quickly after the disclosure. Clothing collected, DNA swabs secured, electronic devices seized, photographs cataloged, every item bagged, labeled, logged, every moment marked on a chain of custody form. In small towns, these procedures feel monumental. Each piece of evidence is both ordinary and unbearable. A t-shirt, a bedsheet, a phone, objects made heavy by context. The Mississippi Crime Lab became the silent partner in this case. Analysts ran DNA comparisons, examined trace evidence, cross-checked fingerprints. Technology promised clarity, but forensic science is rarely instant. Weeks stretched into months as reports trickled back, each one a puzzle piece, incomplete on its own, damning only in combination. For investigators, waiting on results is a test of faith. They cannot move forward without science. Yet every delay risks the erosion of memory, of testimony, of public patience. And for the victim's family, the wait was crueler still, knowing that the proof of their child's suffering sat in a lab, queued among countless other cases, reduced to samples and slides. Not all evidence cooperates. Some tests came back inconclusive. A partial DNA profile, too degraded to confirm. An electronic device wiped clean, leaving only traces of usage. These blind alleys weigh heavy. Every inconclusive result feels like a door closing, another angle lost. Investigators had to pivot to lean harder on testimony, on pattern, on the victim's account. Imagine the psychology of being told your word is not enough. That proof must be drawn from your clothes, from your skin, from your silence, turned into samples. For a child victim, this is re-traumatization masked as procedure. Their body becomes the battlefield of proof. Their privacy becomes evidence. Their trauma becomes a file. For society, forensic science offers comfort. We want to believe in certainty, in lab coats and reports, in the neutrality of machines. But in truth, evidence is messy. Chain of custody can falter. Reports can conflict. And interpretation still requires human judgment. The community of Pontotoc clung to the hope that science would settle what words alone could not. But beneath that hope was fear. What if the science failed? By late 2024, a key forensic breakthrough emerged. DNA samples linked directly to Gonzalez Tovar. A match that, while contested by defense attorneys, tightened the net of probability. It was the kind of evidence that prosecutors crave. Not a narrative, not an interpretation, but a cold, statistical link. For the first time, the case had an anchor that could withstand cross-examination. Is truth only real when science confirms it? What does it mean for a victim's words if only DNA makes them believable? The machinery of evidence does not stop for ethics. It reduces pain to profiles, tears to traces. It transforms trauma into numbers on a chart. And yet, without it, justice falters. This paradox is the heart of forensic psychology. The very tools that strip humanity also safeguard accountability. So, by the close of 2024, the case carried weight. Physical samples, lab results, reports filed in evidence lockers. The machinery of proof had begun to turn in earnest. But the more evidence stacked, the more another truth emerged. The machinery is not perfect. And in those imperfections, in delays, in blind alleys, in inconclusive results, the defense would find its foothold. Courtrooms are not the only place where justice is decided. There is another courtroom, sprawling, chaotic, relentless. The court of public opinion. In Pontotoc County, once the charges against Filiberto Gonzalez Tovar became public, that courtroom lit up. And unlike the law, it does not wait for evidence. It does not wait for testimony. It does not wait for proof. It judges instantly. Newspapers carried the story first, short columns buried beneath larger state news. But in small towns, even small headlines echo. Pontotoc County man arrested on statutory rape charge. Then came the second wave, louder, sharper. Previously deported individual charged in Mississippi child rape. The tone had shifted. This was no longer just about a crime. It was about identity, about borders, about belonging. Framing changes everything. The first headline framed him as a man accused. The second framed him as an immigrant criminal. And with that shift, the story transformed, not just about one child, but about all children. Not just about one man, but about an entire community's vulnerability. For investigators, media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, publicity pressures the system to move faster. On the other, leaks threaten the integrity of proceedings. Every headline risked tainting a jury pool. Every rumor risked undermining testimony. Detectives had to operate in shadows while the story exploded in daylight. For the victim's family, media attention was suffocating. Small towns do not allow anonymity. Whispers spread faster than truth. Every trip to a grocery store carried risk. Eyes lingering, conversations halting mid-sentence. Though their names were protected in print, everyone in town knew. Silence is thin in places where everyone knows everyone. By mid-2025, the case had become fuel for politics. Commentators seized on it as proof of system failure. How could someone deported in 2017 reappear in Mississippi in 2024 to commit such a crime? The story was no longer just Pontotocs. It was national. Talk radio, editorials, social media threads, each one bending the case to fit an argument, a narrative, a policy agenda. The child suffering risked being overshadowed, their pain reduced to a talking point. A PACER docket appeared online. U.S. v. Filiberto Gonzalez Tovar, Northern District of Mississippi. Federal filings now visible to anyone with access. The words were sterile. Illegal reentry after removal. But their meaning inflamed debate. For the public, it became confirmation. The system failed, and a child paid the price. When tragedy becomes a headline, who controls the story? The victim's family? The investigators? Or the loudest voices in the room? The community divided. Some wanted silence, to let courts work without disruption. Others demanded answers. Protests outside courthouses, town meetings filled with rage. In those divides, friendships cracked. Neighbors stopped speaking. Churches split. The crime had fractured not only a child's life, not only a family's safety, but the entire psychological fabric of Pontotoc County. The court of public opinion is never satisfied. It feeds on speculation, thrives on outrage, hungers for certainty where none exists. And by 2025, the Pontotoc case was no longer a local tragedy. It was a national mirror reflecting fear, anger, and mistrust. The courtroom is not built for truth. It is built for process, for walls, a bench, a jury box, a stage where human tragedy is translated in emotions, objections, exhibits. Justice here is not a feeling. It is a procedure. In Pontotoc County, the state charges were the heaviest on the books: statutory rape, felonies carrying decades in prison. In federal court, the indictment read more clinically: illegal reentry after removal following an aggravated felony conviction. Maximum penalty, 20 years. On paper, the charges seemed clear. But in practice, the machinery of law complicates everything. Prosecutors assembled the state file, forensic reports, chain of custody logs, witness statements. Each document notarized, each exhibit pre-labeled. Federal prosecutors built a different file: deportation orders, immigration records, fingerprint comparisons. 2 sets of attorneys, 2 sets of judges, 2 systems grinding forward in parallel, never quite in sync, always overlapping, always competing for primacy. Gonzalez Tovar's defense attorneys did what all defense attorneys must: built doubt, questioning chain of custody on forensic evidence, highlighting inconclusive lab results, challenging translation of victim testimony, arguing procedural missteps in the immigration removal order. Their role was not to prove innocence, only to fracture certainty. In the machinery of law, even small fractures can widen into acquittal. For the child victim, the possibility of testimony loomed like a storm. To speak in court is to relive. To relive is to reopen. Victim advocates fought to shield them, to argue for closed proceedings, for recorded statements instead of live cross-examination. But the defense resisted, citing the Sixth Amendment right to confrontation. And so, the machinery turned, threatening to place a child on the stand, face to face with the accused. In a gallery sat reporters, family members, strangers. Each hearing became a performance. Every objection, every ruling, every pause scribbled in notebooks, tweeted into the ether, whispered through the town. For society, The trial was proof that the system was working. But for those inside, it was a performance of justice, truth forced in a script, pain cross-examined, memory interrogated. In the federal courtroom, a plea agreement emerged. González Tovar, facing overwhelming evidence of reentry after removal, considered admitting guilt in exchange for reduced sentencing. For the victim's family, this revelation was bitter. The plea would secure prison time, yes, but it would do so without ever naming, in open court, what had happened to their child. The federal system could deliver punishment, but not recognition. Is punishment enough if the truth is never spoken aloud? Does law serve justice, or does it simply contain it? Listen to the words that fill the courtroom. Objection, sustained, motion to suppress, continuance, evidentiary hearing. Not a single one speaks of trauma or pain or healing. The machinery of law is not built for emotion. It is built for order. And in that order, humanity can vanish. So the machinery turned. Motions filed. Hearings delayed. Pleas considered. To the public, it looked like progress. To the victim's family, it felt like erasure. And to investigators, it was both proof that their work mattered and fear that the system would dilute it in the process. Justice is supposed to close doors, to seal wounds, to deliver certainty. But in Pontotoc County, when verdicts were read and sentences handed down, the doors did not close. The wounds did not seal. Certainty did not come. Instead, new fractures spread through families, through communities, through the very idea of justice itself. In May 2025, a federal indictment solidified into conviction. González Tovar stood before the court, guilty of illegal reentry after removal. The sentence? Years in federal prison. A number that satisfied statutes, that checked boxes, that made headlines. But for the victim's family, it was a hollow victory. The conviction said nothing of the child's suffering. The record reflected only an immigration violation, sterile, abstract, disconnected from the wound at the center of the case. Meanwhile, the state charges dragged on. Hearings postponed, motions filed, continuances granted. The defense pressed every procedural advantage, slowing momentum, stretching time. Each delay deepened the fracture. The victim's family questioned whether the state would ever see trial, whether their child's voice would ever be heard. For investigators, the federal conviction was bittersweet. On one hand, it guaranteed prison time, ensuring González Tovar could not harm others. On the other, it risked eclipsing the state's pursuit of justice. Their painstaking work on forensic files, interviews, and reports now risked being shelved, overshadowed by the swifter machinery of federal law. For the victim, justice felt like waiting without end. Each court date, a false horizon. Each headline about immigration, a reminder that their personal trauma had been absorbed into politics, stripped of individuality. Imagine the psychology of that child. To know that the crime against you is real, yet to see the system speak only of borders and paperwork. To feel invisible in your own story. The community split further. Some pointed to the federal sentence as proof that justice worked. Others decried it as misdirection, arguing that the real crime, the rape of a child, remained unresolved in court. Justice fractured along lines of perception. Was prison time enough? Or was true justice only possible if the crime against the child was named, acknowledged, judged in state court? And then came the quiet revelation that recontextualized everything. Appeals. Defense attorneys filed motions in federal court, challenging procedure, questioning sentencing enhancements tied to prior convictions. In state court, they filed suppression motions, arguing evidence was tainted, improperly collected. The case was not over. It might never be over. Appeals could drag on for years, leaving the family suspended in endless litigation. What is justice when verdicts are never final? If every conviction can be appealed, if every sentence can be contested, does justice ever truly arrive? Or is it always deferred, always fractured? By 2025, Pontotoc County was tired. The case had hung like a shadow for more than a year. Town meetings dissolved into arguments. Families avoided conversations. Newspapers moved on, but the whispers remained. A crime that began with a single arrest had metastasized into a fracture that touched every corner of the community. So justice fractured. Federal courts delivered punishment, but not recognition. State courts promised recognition, but delayed it into oblivion. Appeals stretched the horizon further still. The machinery of law had worked, but only partially, only unevenly, only incompletely.